Thanks for taking your time to listen and learn about the sociological paradigms. Granted, for most of you, I'm hoping this is not the first time you're learning about them. Rather, it's a review from taking Introduction to Sociology. Or for many of you who might be social majors, you're taking classical theory or modern theory, you're utilizing the paradigms right now or in the last couple semesters or something along those lines, much more than we do in this class, much more than I do when I teach Introduction to Sociology. Like you really, really dig in to the paradigms and probably have a greater operational knowledge than I've even been able to maintain the last 10 years since I was a student in social theories. So, okay, let's talk about what a paradigm is. A paradigm is a way of analyzing the world. It is like a tool with which to analyze what is going on and a lens with which to look through and see social phenomenon. It can be a really, really meaningful, interesting challenge when you utilize this tool, like I said, to take a look at how people's lives are being impacted on both a large scale and sometimes small scale, which I'll talk about in a second. There are three sociological paradigms that oftentimes kind of get referred to as kind of the core of sociology, and that's what we're going to be covering today. Social conflict, structural functionalism, and symbolic interactionism, and I'll be going through them one by one. But I mentioned that large scale and smaller scale aspect of studying the sociological paradigms, or rather utilizing the sociological paradigms. Let's talk about that for a quick sec. There's macro level and micro level. And when we are talking about macro level paradigms, two of the paradigms are macro level. What can get actually a little bit tricky when we utilize paradigms in sociology of families is that so often when we think of families, we're thinking about the fact that families are a small phenomenon. We have our family, we know families, we think of, individual aspects of families and on a smaller scale, as opposed to thinking about the family. Not a family, not my family, not your family, but the family as a social institution. And so, kind of when you take together the entire existence of families in our society and you utilize that as opposed to the specifics of the interactions in a family. So that's what macro level is. When you really, really step back and you treat things in your way of studying them on a large, large scale. And then there's micro level. And so micro level is examining smaller interactions and things along those lines. A lot of times it can be really we can kind of understand micro level phenomenon a lot faster because so much of our interactions take place on a small scale. And unless you have been taking sociology classes, our world is not exactly ever thinking about how much the large scale institutions and aspects of our society are impacting our daily lives. And that's what sociology is studying oftentimes, is looking at the way that our world is working in humongous ways, and so many of the things that we think we do independently as individuals or even independently as families are actually being impacted by these large scale forces. Okay, let's get into the paradigms themselves. This would be a great time to remind you, these next three slides especially, you need to make sure you're writing down what's on the slides. That is the information that is going to be utilized on our first quiz. And so you want to make sure that you get this stuff down. So social conflict, this is a macro level theory. So we're talking about the family as a large scale phenomenon. And when we're talking about social conflict, this is a way of analyzing the world. And that way of analyzing the world is to see the fact that what brings us together is the fact that we are always kind of in tension with each other, and that we are kind of almost fighting, not necessarily fighting like I'm going to punch you in the nose, but fighting for control and for power of what we never have enough of in our society. Scarce resources could include, I would say, one of the main scarce resources is oftentimes finances, money, resources along those lines, like ownership of resources, like homes or land or things along those lines. But, resources could be a natural resource, like fresh drinking water. Resources could even be something along the lines of, if when you think about the fact that, we only have so much time in our day and so much time in our lives, and how we have control over that or don't have control over that. And then as we talk about having control over resources, who does have control, right? And oftentimes that power and control is very centralized and it's only a handful of people. To give you a little backstory on social conflict, this is authored by Karl Marx. Oftentimes, Karl Marx is the only person that people outside of sociology have ever heard of, like as a sociologist. And Karl Marx put together this concept of social conflict as he saw the Industrial Revolution taking place. Basically, as you know, thinking about our history classes, we've gone from an agricultural society where we have, families and farms and kind of making your own way in the world, to more cities and factories, and who owns those factories and who controls your life and your job and your livelihood, right? So that's kind of what he was looking at when he decided, you know what, this is the way that society works. This is the basis of society, that we don't have enough in our society, and some people have control over it. And how do we manage that all together when some people have the power and some people don't? So let's talk about an example of sociology of families, right? Families and social conflict. I would say that when you especially, you know what, here, let's take it because it's a macro level. We're going to look at an institution. So we have the institution of family, but let's talk about another institution, the medical institution, right? So families require medical care. They require affordable medical care, accessible medical care, strong medical care, and really thinking about this, medical care in the medical institution. And I know so many of my students are individuals who are really interested in going into being employees of the medical institution. Who has control over it, right? So let's say the scarce resource is affordable, good health care. And then to think about, well, wait a second, who controls access to that healthcare? And it's a lot of times the individuals or groups that own insurance companies. When you think about another institution, the government can have an element of control over it. And what is the tension between that? Who has power and things along those lines? So that's just one way of looking at social conflict. Social conflict is a grumpy theory. Really, honestly, you're kind of always looking at the deep, dark underbelly of the fact that nobody has, well, some people do have enough. Some people have more than enough. But many, 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 many people do not have what they need, no matter in some cases how hard they work. And that's something we're definitely going to be digging into this semester in Sociology of Families. Okay, let's move on to the next one, structural functionalism. This is another macro level theory. And structural functionalism is actually going to operate in a similar way to what I kind of just described to social conflict based upon the example that I used. When we talk about structural functionalism, we're going back to all those institutions. So structural functionalism is saying that the way that society works is we have these large institutions and they all need to be working together. So some of the examples of institutions are the family, like I keep repeating, but we also have education, we have the government, we can have religion, and we can have the medical institution. All these different aspects of our society are these humongous, bureaucratic, large-scale systems. And the key to structural functionalism, one of the ways you always want to be on the lookout with structural functionalism, is that if one of these institutions is struggling, the whole society is going to be impacted. So we could argue that our education system is struggling in some cases. When you think about it, now reaching the point in adulthood that I have, and especially being an educator myself, but mostly actually my husband, Sean, being a junior high teacher for the last 20 years, we have seen the philosophy of education shift 1,000,000%. So you have the idea of No Child Left Behind, which was a political philosophy for education that it was, developed by the government, and the government oftentimes, has, very, very different ideas depending on your political affiliation. So with No Child Left Behind being developed by one presidential administration, the whole focus was testing, right? And we'll talk about this later on in class. The idea that you need to take standardized tests, that that's the most important thing and everything else. Well, then a new a new presidential administration comes in, new political concepts and ideas and values and everything else. And the education system, and this is, the entire United States, we flip it from No Child Left Behind and a focus on standardized testing to Common Core. And Common Core is a very, very, very different educational philosophy. And so that idea that instead of now we're just taking tests and tests are important and the answers on the tests, Common Core is looking at things in a much more abstract way. So I always kind of joke, like, the answer is B in No Child Left Behind as an educational philosophy. Like, the answer is the answer is the answer. Well, Common Core comes in and wants more critical thinking, wants students applying things more. And so now it's kind of almost like, well, what does B even mean? Like, it's just both work, but the fact that we switched so drastically from one educational idea to the next, some educators, some families, some students themselves could argue that the educational institution has a weakness in the fact that it doesn't do anything halfway. It isn't moderate in its decisions. It jumps all in 1,000%. And I don't know necessarily if that really helps the education system be strong to make such drastic changes on such a fast-paced basis so often. So when you think about the education system being weak, and I kind of went off a little bit there talking about a couple of different ways the education system has worked. But what else does that impact? That impacts the family, because if students aren't getting a strong education going forward into an economy, how will they be strong earners of, the goal of our society, right? A middle class lifestyle. It impacts the medical institution, because where do all our medical professionals get educated? In our education system. It impacts every aspect of our society. So that's an example of how, if you were to argue that the education system is weak, how it could possibly really, really impact the other aspects. So when you're talking about structural functionalism, again, you're talking about all the institutions at work and the fact that you want them to be running as, efficiently and with as much strength and health as possible, because otherwise society is really going to be impacted overall. Okay, last one. Symbolic interactionism, and this is our micro little theory. This is all about symbols and the ways that we are utilizing everything that we're taking in. All these words I'm saying in this PowerPoint, they're symbols, right? So when we just understand the same language, the same symbol system. All the clothes that we, wear in our daily basis, what the ones that we wear to school versus the ones that we wear at home and everything else, it's all symbols. It's so all of our information that we take in is symbols. And so the basis of society, so says symbolic interactionism, is that we understand and constantly renegotiate and, you know, re like interact, I guess, over and over and over. That was not a word, reinteract. That's the basis with which we understand each other in every single way. And think about how many symbols you're surrounded by, especially nowadays in the last 15 years or so with the internet, and especially social media, and especially the fact that we have cell phones and that we're constantly on them and things like that. We are bombarded by symbols. Now, here's the thing with symbolic interactionism. These symbols are always changing. They are always, always, always being modified in different ways, whether it's how we use them on an individual basis, or if, the word or something itself changes its meaning. Let's talk about an example of symbolic interactionism that has been really interesting to me, because when I first started using it as an example, it was more relevant. And so it changed, and that made it relevant to discuss as a symbol changing. And now it's even changed since I started using it as a relevant symbol. And you're like, what are you even talking about? Tell me what it is. The word ratchet, right? Not a good word. When you think about what the heck is a ratchet is a tool that you tighten down bolts with, right? So how did the word ratchet go from being a tool in, a toolbox in your garage to a gendered insult? think about that. Like, and students a lot of times say, oh, well, it's like rap music or something will come up with it. I'm like, wow, to think about the brain power that it takes to create a new meaning for a word that is oftentimes derogatory, like that kind of investment in creativity, really, there's a lot of things you could do with that that might not just insult people. Um, think about this though. So, 5, 6 years ago, when I used ratchet as an example, ratchet was a little bit more prevalent. Now, it still exists as a word that is a gendered insult, but it's kind of already gone away in its relevance. And so I am not, because, I'm all like old mom in her early 40s. I'm not cool enough to even know what the terrible words are now. I need to make sure that I stay relevant, I suppose, as I get to be an older and older woman and have a sense of what's going on in the world. But think about who knows these symbols. How do they change? How does a word that, meant a tool turn into a gendered insult and then kind of just dissipate no matter what? So when you think about families and you think about symbols, how I mean, the family itself is a symbol. The who is in a family, how we define family, the ways in which we celebrate with our families, the traditions we have with our families, all symbols. Everything is a symbol all the time. And so I really, really hope that when you go to apply these theories, that symbolic interactionism is the one that you're just bombarded with ideas because, oh my goodness, there's this and there's that. So let's quickly review. Social conflict, macro level, large scale. You want to be looking at who does not have enough, whatever the resource may be, money, water, otherwise, and who has control over it. Structural functionalism, the institutions that are working together to make our society operate and make it strong. And when one of those institutions, whether it's the medical institution, whether it's the family itself, if it is weakened in some way, all of society is going to be impacted. And then symbolic interactionism. All of our world is symbols, and those symbols are constantly changing. So hopefully this helps you get ready to start to apply these concepts in class. And again, I really, really appreciate you taking your time to listen to this.